In this video, we're going to go ahead and get all of our components configured. I like stubbing out my components first, then going back into Unity, adding them to the different bits in our level, and then filling out the implementations. That's a workflow that I use quite often when working on scripts. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how or what modifications we need to make to our world in order to handle the implementation of the character controller that we've yet to actually do. But we will be doing it shortly. So what do we have to do? Well, first of all, our player is going to need a player. So that's our player has the player script. Remember, the player script is responsible for controlling the character controller. But that means it also needs a character controller. So let's add character controller 2D to it. So we'll see that it has, so far, it just has a couple parameters. The default parameters, see what I mean about marking it as serializable and using public fields? Default parameters now shows up in our inspector as something we can drop down and manipulate. We're going to leave our default parameters the way they are. But you'll notice we have a platform mask. Now, the platform mask, again, is going to determine what layers are going to be used to collide on. So, for example, we will see that all of these objects have a default layer. See, they don't have anything, they're set to default. If I click back onto the player, we'll see that we have nothing selected. So the character controller is not going to collide with anything. What I want to do, though, is I want to create a layer in Unity that I can mark all my platforms for. So everything that I want the player or other enemies to collide with, I'll mark up with a specific layer tag. So let's go ahead and do that, because all these parameters are fine except for the platform mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to the top right and click on layers, and then I'm going to come down here to edit layers. We'll see our common tag sorting layers thing. Remember our sorting layers that we did before with background, mountains, tree line, foreground, player? Well, we're going to be modifying this list now, the layers list. We're going to create a user layer 8, and we're going to call it platforms. So the user layer 8 is on layer platforms. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go back to our player. So I'm going to click on my player, and I'm going to set the platform mask to platforms. Now, our character controller knows what objects it can collide with. Also, platform mask supports as many of these as you want. So that's cool too. Okay, so our default parameters are good, our platform mask is good, our player script is added, our character controller script is added. We can go ahead and hit apply. By hitting apply, we have now committed those changes to our player prefab. And our player prefab, on every level we instantiate it on, will have a player script and a character controller 2D script. But we're not quite done yet with making our player usable in the world. What I need to do is I need to add a rigid body and a collider to my player. Let's start with the rigid body. So what is a rigid body? Well, a rigid body in physics is a body that is not mutable. Like a cup would be a rigid body in physics terminology, because the geometry of a cup isn't going to change, or, well, it's not going to change if you don't allow for people to break it. But a rigid body allows us to express a physical object. Now, the rigid body is needed to work with the physics engine of Unity, but it's also needed to work with just collisions. That's because if we have colliders set up on our objects, but we don't put rigid bodies on them, and we move them, we'll run into some massive issues with Unity, because Unity expects that any object that has a collider on it that moves should have a rigid body on it. Now you'll notice that we have two options when we hit add component and type in RIG. We have rigid body and we have rigid body 2D. The rigid body that we want to add to our player is going to be the rigid body 2D, which has been introduced as of Unity 3.4, or 4.3, sorry. Now, the rigid body has a bunch of parameters, a bunch of physics parameters, such as mass, linear drag, angular drag, gravity scale, fixed angle, is kinematic, interpolate, sleeping mode, collision detection. Well, the only parameter that we care about is kinematic. By setting is kinematic to true, by checking that box, we've effectively told Unity, yes, I want a rigid body. Yes, I want you to do um, efficient collision detection with this body, assuming that this body is moving. But I want to handle the movement of my object. I don't want you to do things like add gravity or have it bounce off something or use physics materials. I want to be responsible for all of those calculations. So we want to make sure that any body that we add to the world we set is kinematic to true. And that will make it so that we can well, that'll just make it so we can position our player however we want to without having to worry about Unity's physics engine. So we're basically bypassing the physics engine entirely. But we're not done yet. We've specified that the player has a rigid body, so we've specified that this is a physical object in the world, but we haven't specified the geometry of the physical object. You might say, well, obviously it's a circle. I mean, anybody can see that. Well, in reality, Unity doesn't know that it's a circle. What we're seeing is a graphical representation of our player, which in reality is just the sprite renderers rendering a picture onto the screen. Unity itself doesn't know anything about the geometry of our player at all. In order to do collision detection or raycasting of any form, we need to have some sort of geometry added to this player that will allow Unity to understand the rules that are applied when it collides or doesn't collide with another object.
Nelson, I'm getting the feeling, the way you're talking, that a circle is not going to be the best route for us to go.
No, we're not going to be using a circle. One of the reasons we're not using a circle, though, is because of this method right here. Using a circle would be a little bit very challenging to do. This method of character controller that we're handling is going to be a rectangle. But that's the great thing about having the concept of the presentation of an object be different from the geometry of that object. So, or at least the geometry that that object uses for collision detection. So effectively, what we need is a collider. So I said all of that just to say that a collider is how we tell Unity what the important geometry of an object is and how it collides with other objects. If we hit add component and type in collider, we'll see a variety of colliders. We'll see everything from box colliders, box collider 2D, capsule collider, circle collider 2D, edge collider 2D, mesh collider, polygon collider 2D, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, the colliders that we're going to be looking for are the 2D variants. In fact, if I were to try to add a box collider, I should get an error. I do, because a box collider can't be added to an object if a rigid body 2D exists. In much the same way, I wouldn't be able to add a box collider 2D to an object if a rigid body 3D existed on that object. Okay, so a box is a three-dimensional box, a box 2D is a two-dimensional box, capsule is a three-dimensional capsule, circle is a two-dimensional circle, and so on and so on. So basically, everything that's 2D at the end is what we can use. If we wanted pixel-perfect collision,
Can I guess?
Sure.
Can I guess? You want a box collider?
Yes, I do want a box collider. Okay, so that gives me a box collider by adding that component to our object. And you'll notice that inside the scene window, we now have a little gizmo in here. It's a little green box. You'll also notice that our box is really not positioned or proportioned in the way that we would really want it to be for our player. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and change the parameters of our box collider. So I want to set its size in the X direction up to about, let's do about 2.4, and then set its Y is probably going to be 2.4. Let's actually do, just eyeball it, 2.71, that's fine. So now our box pretty much mostly contains our object. We could make it a little bit wider, I suppose. The problem is this white space that you see right here is going to allow our character to look like it's floating if he's standing on an edge of something. That's just something that we're going to have to live with the way that we're handling collisions. There could be alternative methods of doing this, but just keeping things simple with a character controller that's really flexible without requiring a whole lot of code, we're just going to have to live with the limitation that we'll have some instances where the player looks like he's kind of floating. But I think that's acceptable.
Well, many of the 2D games of the past, you'll notice your character kind of floating out over edges and stuff. Now you know why.
Yeah. So, so that pretty much wraps up our player as far as configuring him. So let's go ahead and hit apply so that we apply all of these parameters to his prefab. Now let's talk about the world. Well, we know that we have to add all of these objects to the platform layer in order for them to be recognized by the character controller. We also know that we'll have to add colliders to each one of these objects in order for the raycasts from the player to return a result. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and come over here into just a blank part of my world, and I'm going to open up my prefabs folder, and I'm going to drag out my platform. Then I'm going to open up tiles, and I'm going to drag in everything but tree. Well, that's not going to work. Okay, so let's just select, let's bring in dirt, let's bring in dirt full, let's bring in dirt grass, grass full, grass mid, dirt mid, punji sticks. So these are all the tile prefabs that we've already created. What I'm going to do is show you guys a little magic trick. We're going to be able to modify our objects, and then as our prefab, and then hit apply, and all of the objects that are instantiated from this prefab will follow suit. So let's just select all these objects. Platform, dirt, so all of these objects are right here. Let's just select all of them. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit add component, and I'm going to add a box collider 2D to all of these objects. So you'll notice that we get a box collider 2D. It's not appropriately positioned for anything really but the punji sticks. An alternative implementation is we could, instead of adding the box collider to the parent objects, the parent prefabs, we could instead add the box collider to the child sprites. I don't really want to do that because the box collider will only pass messages such as is colliding and whatnot to the object that it is attached to. Meaning if we, instead of adding, so notice here where we have this little box, our box collider's on the lower left hand side instead of in the center. Well, the reason that is because our dirt full is a child of our main object. So if I were to add a box collider to our main object with a mesh sprite render on it, our box collider would work. But our parent prefab object, if I were to add a script onto it that supported on-trigger inter messages, for example, it wouldn't be invoked because those on-trigger inter messages are only invoked on the object that has the box collider. So I don't want to add the box collider to the child object. Okay, our punji sticks are good. No, they're not. We actually want our collider. No, that's exactly what we want right there for our punji sticks. We just really want them to be.
You don't want it like halfway down the stick?
I guess we could do that. I mean, the box collider will determine where exactly the object dies when they hit. So we could take the Y down a little bit and then take the X, or sorry, not the X size, but the X center, or the Y center, and move it down a little bit. Or maybe up a little bit and up a little bit. Really, this is all about tweaking. The next thing we want to do...
As is all game development.
Yeah. The next thing that we want to do is make sure that we set the is trigger to true, because we want this to be a trigger volume. And then the next thing we want to do is set the layer to platforms. Once we do that, we hit apply. And then after we've applied that to our punji sticks, let's come up here to our punji sticks and see that not only did our box collider come in, its trigger's true set, and it's now on layer platforms. So by editing this object down here, this arbitrary prefab, making that change, it applied it to every instance of that prefab. So that's why I'm down here, kind of off our level, editing the prefabs instead of being inside the level editing the prefabs. All right, let's go ahead and do this for all of our objects. So I'm going to delete our punji sticks. Let's do dirt mid. So our dirt mid has this collider right here. Let's move it up into the center. So move it to about 1, I think. Move it across by 2, maybe. And then size it forward. No, we're going to have to move it to about... Once we get this value right for one of these guys, that value will apply to all of them. And I'll show you guys that in a minute here. Let's do 3.8 and then... No, let's do 3.9. And that's fine. I don't care if the collider moves a little bit. There, 1.92, and then we can bring this probably down to 3.84. And then our y, just increase our y value, move our y down just a tiny bit, and then move it up a little bit, and that should be good. So 1.87, 0.97. Let's set its layer to platforms. And let's also set the child objects to layer platforms as well. And then let's hit apply. So now all of our dirt mids have been applied. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note of my sizes, 3.84 and 1.87 versus 1.2, or in addition to 1.29 and 0.97. Let's also make sure that our scaling works appropriately. So if I try to scale up my object and scale down my object, notice that my box collider is still stuck on the right value. So that's exactly what we want. So let's change its scale back to 111. Oops, 111. Okay, so now our dirt mid has been done. Let's delete it so we know that we're done with our dirt mid. Now let's go to our dirt grass mid. So we're just moving along along this row. Let's go ahead and give his box collider the same parameters, which will pretty closely approximate what we have because it's almost the same dimensions. So we'll do a size of 3.84, 1.87. We'll do a center of 1.92 and a y of 0.97. And you'll see that is pretty good, actually. I want to move the y up just a tad. And then maybe move its size up, and then maybe move its y down. All right, so that's our dirt grass mid. Let's go ahead and set the layer to platforms. Yes, change old children, and then hit apply. So now our dirt grass mid has a collider. And we can also verify that when we stretch it, the box collider follows along proportionally to how much we stretch it, which is exactly what you want. So let's go ahead and delete that class, or delete that object, and move on to our dirt grass full. Actually, I wonder, we can move on to our dirt grass mid next, because these values that I typed in should work almost perfectly for our dirt grass. So our x is going to be 3.84. Our y is going to be 1.87. Our center is 1.92, and our y is 0.97. Then let's make our size in the y-axis a little bit smaller, and then bring it down a little bit, and then maybe make it a little bit bigger, And I think that looks good. Make sure isTrigger is true. I might have forgot to set isTrigger as true on my other objects. I'll be sure to go through all my other prefabs in a moment, make sure that isTrigger is set to true. We'll make sure its layer is set to platforms. We'll change all the child layers to platforms, and then we'll hit apply. Notice that I'm not adding rigid bodies to any of these. The reason I'm not adding rigid bodies to any of these is because none of these are expected to move. None of our tiles are ever expected to move, and therefore can be static colliders. However, we will need to add a rigid body to our platforms because our platforms are obviously going to move. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this object, our dirt grass, because we have that set up properly. Let's go into our dirt grass full. X size is 3.84. That's going to be perfect for every one of these guys. Y size 1.87. Our center is going to be 1.92 in the X axis, and then our Y is going to be 0.97. Okay, so let's go ahead and move our Y up a little bit, and then make our Y a little bit bigger, and then move it up, and then make it a little bigger. Yes, I know this is tedious, guys, but sometimes game development is tedious.
In fact, I'd say it's tedious more often than it's not.
Unfortunately, that's true. But yes, we have to make sure that we get all of these guys set up properly. But once we have them set up properly, we can create as many of them as we like, and we can create more complex levels. I mean, really, game development like this is all about creating little pieces that we can use to construct a full working game. Okay, so let's make sure we set isTrigger to true, set the layer to platforms, set it for all the children, hit apply. We have now done our dirt grass full. All right, let's do our dirt full. Actually, our dirt full should have the same parameters as our dirt grass full. So let's just go ahead and copy them over. 3.84 goes into the X. 3.9 goes into the Y. 1.92 goes into the center X. 1.93 goes into the center Y. Matches up pretty much exactly. So that is now our box collider for our dirt full. Let's set isTrigger to true. Set the layer to platforms, and then hit apply. Remember, we are editing the parent objects. We're adding the collider to the parent objects, not to the child objects. So we're not applying it to dirt full. So I think this pretty much wraps up this video.